Today on Building the Open Metaverse.
If you saw an X-Wing fighter, roar overhead during, some story moment, you could actually click on it and you'd be in the driver's seat and you would be taken down into a war scene, and then you could basically play and engage.
Welcome to Building the Open Metaverse, where technology experts discuss how the community is building the open metaverse together. Hosted by Patrick Cozzi from Cesium and Marc Petit from Epic Games.
My name is Marc Petit. I'm from Epic Games, and my co-host is Patrick Cozzi from Cesium. Patrick, how are you?
Hi, Mark. I'm doing fantastic. We're in for a real treat today. I'm looking forward to learning a lot.
Yeah, because today we're super happy to welcome John Gaeta. He's an inventor, an innovator, an Academy Award-winning designer. He was Senior VP Creative Strategy at Magic Leap, Chief Creative Officer in World.ai, works on a number of things we're going to talk about for the podcast. John, we're very happy to have you on board. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Mark and Patrick. Appreciate it.
So first thing we like to do in the podcast is ask about your journey to the metaverse. And in your case, immersive storytelling has been at the heart of everything you've been doing. So it's probably a long journey. But please introduce us to your background.
Yes, I think everyone's journey is probably not necessarily a deliberate one. It's, a lot of serendipity and I'll try to be brief about it. The short story is, I chose to go to university in New York City, went to film school there at NYU, had that sort of life experience, began sort of understanding the sort of limitlessness of storytelling, from mentors, teachers and such, and then began experimenting. But of course, the real sandbox for someone doing that is just living in New York City itself, because it is just so vast with, things you would never expect to be happening on the other side of a door. And so, of course, met a lot of people and wound up finding my crowd. They tended to be more, I lived in the East Greenwich Village for a while, met a lot of artists that did a lot of things that had nothing to do with film. And eventually found a home relatively quickly, working in animation, in stop motion animation of all things. At the time, it wasn't really a very regimented area of filmmaking. I mean, there weren't heavy union presence in those times, because it was just, it was so unusual in just this sort of the routine that one would have to go through. I would essentially babysit Mitchell cameras until like 5 a.m, almost every night of the week, while animators, hand animated and pushed, their little figurines up hills night after night. But because I fell in with that crowd, I was lucky enough to hear about some unusual happening that wasn't in New York City. It was the fact that a fellow named Doug Trumbull, who passed away last year, was retreating from Hollywood and starting some super secretive high-tech studio of some sort in Western Massachusetts. And it truly was actually, what he decided to do there was to essentially push the bleeding edge of everything you could imagine, from, robotic camera systems to automation, and how, miniatures and things like that were made. He embraced things like using CAD, and I think maybe this is where we have our first connection. I mean, we experimented with using software like Softimage, for example, for experimental camera path creation, and eventually we realized that there was a lot more to be done once one understood essentially, I don't know, how a physical camera, or how we physically could relate to some digital content. So it seems very simplistic these days. People take it for granted, but just the very ability to graft a computer generated, and that back then it was like early days, right? This was just not that long after Tron. How to graph the digital thing to a physical thing was a really big deal. And for me, it kind of unlocked some thoughts right off the bat, right? How the real world could intertwine if one understood, some essential things like, light, how does light sort of fall upon both equally convincingly, and of course, spatially, how do they interlock? And then eventually, dynamically, how does something in motion in the real world interlock with a generated thing? And so even from those early days, I mean, back then we didn't really call it, computer vision quite yet, but it was early days for that. And to me, it was like paintbrushes, and all of that sort of under Doug Trumbull's super imagination and high tech, factory. He was the type of person that he was like a toy maker, but with high tech toys. So if something didn't exist, like a camera that could, shoot IMAX, but fit inside a space this big, right? He would make it. He would machine it, make it, stick it on a robotic camera that he also had made, right? And so you're in this atmosphere where, like, anything is like, if there's a limit, anything, you can move past the limit. And so there was some pretty interesting, lessons there. And I don't know, that begins a journey, I guess, right? So I've gone from those times to, always, believing that, we could get deeper on these things, and kept hanging with colleagues that were supercharged. I did meet a few that to this day, they're still my friends, to this very day. And that is another sort of benefit, that you don't have to be like contained and aligned to one company, right? You can have colleagues that move and migrate around into really fascinating places. And if you just stay friends and you keep speaking to each other almost collegiately, you can learn quite a lot about what's happening and what's changing. So I guess that's why we're still here talking.
Or you can even go pick up an Oscar on stage with those friends.
The kind of amazing thing about being in the game this long, at least a couple decades or more, is that a lot of us began reading about science fiction in scripts that were in things in movies, right? That we've been like in this game long enough to see those things manifest, to actualize, to actually help in actualizing these things.
Yeah, and that led you, I alluded to the Matrix. Of course, we have to talk about the Matrix and your role as a designer and all the work you did with the Wachowski siblings. And so you did win Best Visual Effects Oscar for it at the 73rd Academy Awards. Was it back 2000, right?
For certain. It felt interesting because getting deep into the 90s, for the general public, for society at large, was a big decade of change, because people began using and feeling comfortable with the internet. And, I'd say at the beginning of that decade, it wasn't so, right? It was kind of a strange, unnatural thing, I suppose, right? Using your computer all the time to interact and communicate. But by the end of that decade, people were doing it. And of course, it would just exponentiate the following decade. But, with that became the capacity of the everyday person to sort of expand their thought about what was possible on the other side of that screen, I think. And so it was relevant. I mean, it was stylish and as well for the times. It was edgy for the times. But the thing that I think resonated was this idea that we're heading towards some sort of, digital life that could end up essentially being, for some people, a way of life.
And John, beyond movies, you started looking at game development and immersion tech. I mean, you were co-founder of Lucasfilm's ILM Lab, X Lab. You're SVP of creative strategy of Magic Leap, executive creative producer of The Matrix Awakening, and now chief creative officer at InWorld AI. I mean, what was it about video games and immersion tech that brought you in?
I will always feel blessed to have had as many years working with storytellers, uh, writers, and artists and filmmakers, and just to understand how to sculpt a story and how powerful, of course, that can be and rewarding that can be. But the one thing about the movie business, which was really, it weighed heavily, was, to make a movie is a mountainous effort, and it still is a mountainous effort. It takes a lot of people. It's a really big, difficult product to make, and even more so to make an exceptional sort of story in film. But the thing that was always kind of difficult about the end was, well, if you lived for the end, right, and the film didn't turn out to be a masterpiece, or the audience just didn't, connect to it, it doesn't feel great, right? Two things came from that feeling. First, I had to myself personally had to get more zen about the process along the way. So you must really, I mean, it is of course enjoyable, but you can't really get fixated by the end necessarily. Of course, you want everything that you do. Of course, you do it the same way. You give everything you have, and you hope for the best. But if you're not getting something rewarding out of the whole journey in some fashion, as hard as it can be, if you're not passionate, then there's a problem there. And I mean, for some painters, it's only about the act of painting. And then once the painting is done, it's like dead to them. So first lesson is, was that I had to learn to sort of be okay, right, with whatever happened at the end. But the second part that was really just getting at me after a while was the world seemed to end when the movie ended, right? So you went through all of this to world build, to make a universe, and then the movie would end, and the lights would go out, and you'd go home, and then the world basically stopped, at that moment. And that really was difficult for me for a while, and it really started to motivate me to start thinking about dynamic, ever-living worlds, right? So real time really was an opportunity in games, and all of the technology of games was an opportunity to sort of, help build a living world. And that was the big motivation. And of course, it wasn't so easy. It's taken quite a while, right, to try to get a persistent world through games and other real-time entertainment, immersive entertainment. And we're still pretty much, in the early stages of that sort of thing. But that was my main motivation. And of course, I thought that if it was, the type of world where you could either bear witness to, or literally be part, by way of your journey through it, your path through it, essentially create as rich a story as one could have, in some of these cinematic experiences, well, then you had it all, right? So you could have, in and of itself, an infinite matrix of individual stories crisscrossing through an interactive world. That could be through gameplay, and it could be through other kinds of engagements. But there's really quite a lot of potential there, and it's just only going to get better.
So I wanted to double back on The Matrix. I mean, it had a huge cultural impact. I still remember the first time I saw it. I'm sure that's true for many of us. Did you think that would happen?
No, of course not. I mean, no. You don't really know these things. That's what I was sort of referring to is before, was that you kind of, if you've made the choice to commit yourself to go into a project, a big film or game project, you have to put everything into that. It's going to be a big investment in your life and career, but you just don't know whether the audience will take it up. I suppose it will. It's different now, right? Once the world is up and running, right? So if there's engagement, you can sort of predict, how the sort of participants and fans will feel about it. But back then, no, we had no idea.
A lot of new technology were a pioneer on those movies. Bullet time is well known, but it was the early use of photogrammetry as well for real-time movie making, and a lot of work on digital humans as well. So
yeah, very little of that would have happened without, quite frankly, the participation of individuals. Like there are a number of individuals in Epic, that were on those projects, and essentially we had, freedom to pursue whatever techniques we wanted to, but also a bit of a thesis, right? We were excited about this project, and we decided that we would do everything we could to imagine what methods might actually be needed to make virtual reality. And that immediately steered us towards, less about fabricating things from the ground up, and more about capturing reality capture. And so our thesis was to do everything we could to, get the first building blocks of reality capture up and running. And we ran with that, and we were backed by the Wachowskis. Were like, do it, go ahead, we'll shoot backup shots for you in case you fail, which was, smart. But they allowed us, and when I say us, I mean like really quite a lot of people. There's no, I can't get into that now, but like, yeah, that was the thesis that we would from those days to today, you see some of those things. They went through years and years of how would I put it? A lot of mimicry of it, but you absolutely see some of the pillars of volumetric capture, for example, you can trace back to some of those experiments. Image-based maps, three-dimensional maps. There's like crazy things that I wouldn't say it all began with the Matrix, because we ourselves were inspired by little kernels around the world, but it was like a time, those times.
We also love that original transmedia vision for the Matrix, where there's the movie, but there's also the Animatrix series and the video game. Was there a comprehensive strategy behind that?
The way I would describe that is like, that wasn't by design by any studio. That was driven by Wachowski passion. I mean, they truly were influenced and super energized by comic books and anime, and we know all the lore at this point about them, but it was true. They played video games. They loved all these things, right? They were really living in the times, as younger men, right? So it wasn't just that they wanted to make a big franchise, and, one could debate its success. There certainly have been other attempts at transmedia franchises that, like Star Wars, for example, has had more success for certain, but the idea that what they really wanted to do was to have the stories, cross over one another, and to allow the fans to, expand their ideas of the universe through all these different channels. And so it was an instinctual thing for them to do that. It was an instinctual strategy. And they had, at the time in Hollywood, they had the ability, the power, to push into other products. So they tried it. Like I said, I mean, like we made an MMO. We did all these things that weren't really common, at the time. The animatrix was, also rather novel at the time, to essentially not just, how would I put it? Hollywood's really good at ripping off other brilliant creatives and works around, from the past. And we knew that, Japanese and Eastern animation was absolutely critical influence in our visual and, choreography, and even like the way, events happen, inexplicable events, right? We were looking at that and we're like, wow, they are really ahead in many ways. They're freer, and so we wanted to honor to some degree, as opposed to just rip them off. We wanted to honor them. So we allowed them to, allow a number of companies and great directors to do these shorts. And it was, really a great meeting of two things. And, since then, a number of, properties have tried this again. But the idea of the animatrix and that, other way of, telling sort of, telling stories. I mean, it's something that's these days done very well through streamer channels and such. But back then it was pretty new feeling.
And then 20 years later, the Matrix Resurrections. How did it come to pass? Because 20 years after, the stakes were much higher. People had a better understanding of, in virtual worlds, immersive. The metaverse had become a household. Well, how did that impact how the team approached the movie?
Feels like a movie about people who were together at school or college, and they all went to have separate lives, and then they come back again, right? Unexpectedly, a reunion, like, oh, we're going to go to the beach house and hang out together. And we learned that everybody is way down the road, right, on things. It's interesting in that regards. I mean, Kim Library, who's CTO of Epic, we were, at this point trying to actualize some stuff, right? We're trying to make real-time worlds, and we're not sure immediately. Well, first of all, it was wonderful to essentially, as friends, because we spent years together when we made so we spent years together, and we went through a lot of stuff together, making those movies. 9/11 happened while we were making those movies. They were a pretty bonding experience for everybody. And then we all left and started doing the different things. But, Kim and I were like, okay, we're kind of heavily involved in other stuff now. I don't think we can kind of circle back to visual effects right now, right? And go do, they shot the picture during the pandemic, which made it even more kind of crazy to pull off. But to depict, what it would be like to be in a cinematic fidelity open world that you could play or tell stories in was really kind of where we always wanted to be going anyhow, and what we've been chipping away at for years on end. So we're like, this is how we'd like to participate. And so we did. We worked with the actors and with Lana and others on that. So our so we were a little bit cautious on the cinema. We were gonna update as you see fit in the way you see fit, and we'll just kind of find our happy space, in that endeavor. I also, thought that, well, let's continue some other aspects of the thesis. There were, not a lot of people know this, but there was a little bit of a larger plan. Here it is, I'm going to come back to, I had hoped that, somehow putting this universe back out there in our times, in 2020X, right? The sort of emerging AI age, right? And all that's going on, with metaverse, et cetera, it would be a natural, right, to be reignited. And I was making certain assumptions, and so I thought, okay, I'll prepare for this. I'll see how people could get deeper into this, assuming that this happened, right, on a social level. So my thought was, well, it wasn't just Awakens right as a demonstration, but it was like what was going on there was also this thought that it could essentially be the backlot for a new form of experiential storytelling, that we could make, new animatrix and immersive byproducts of all sorts. So I started down this road testing for this, and so writing up some, papers on this, and doing some tests. So we did other tests that were kind of like Love, Death, and Robots on steroids, ambition meets Matrix Awakens, et cetera, et cetera. And so it wasn't really, thank goodness that Epic had the sort of will the will to complete that Awakens project, because it's the one piece really that sort of got all the way through. But
yeah, in season 2 we had a full episode with Kim on the making of Matrix Awakens. So if people want to refer back to it more technically, they can look back at that episode in the podcast. So let's go switch back in time to another franchise where you got to practice immersive storytelling, which is the Star Wars franchise. So in 2013, you joined Lucasfilm to contribute to the renaissance of Star Wars right after the Disney acquisition. And you co-founded ILMX Lab, where you got to develop several immersive storytelling projects. So when you look back at that time, and first I have a personal question. I remember you on stage at the Soft Image User Group in 1999. You were the anti-establishment person.
yeah,
And then you joined Disney. What happened?
through my career, I swing on the pendulum back and forth between who doesn't like being heavily resourced with incredible technology, et cetera, and incredibly talented people around you. Everybody likes that. But after a while, those institutions can really grind us all down. And we need to essentially, have a moment where we can be free, not encumbered by bureaucracy, et cetera. And sometimes you really want to get into a more self-governed, startup mentality where you can really, you can take high risk. Sometimes you can take high risk in institutions, but that it doesn't last forever. With coming into Lucasfilm, of course, a lot of friends there before I got there. I was almost intimidated coming there with such legendary brilliance in there. But there was going to be a new generation of Star Wars, and there was going to be literally for the foreseeable many years all sorts of multimedia activity, right? So there was, and Kathy Kennedy, who was super excited at the outset, and it was going to be a bit of a renaissance period for them, on every level, right? From concept to writing, to world building, to, high-end new methodologies for the next, types of media that Star Wars could be put into. I mean, Star Wars in the past, when it was really, doing very well, was always a franchise that you would see the next generation of something, right? Like video games, all sorts of things. So we're like, okay, you know what? At the time just before I got invited to come in there, I was experimenting actually with this stuff with Microsoft. I was experimenting with augmented reality back in 2008, 9, 10, 11. They had these, with the beginning of their media, these labs that they were, using, things like the Kinect, but not for, overly simplistic button pushing, but for like basically augmented reality experimentation, amazing experimentation. I was doing that, and hanging out in the middle of San Francisco in the city at one of these stealth codes doing that stuff, and then because, we're going to embark, because Lucasfilm was going to embark on all this new innovation across years. So like, oh, this is a good time for me. If you want to consider coming in, this is a good time. We're willing to take risks and take chances. And it really was that atmosphere. So call it a Renaissance moment. And then did in fact go in there and did in fact get freedom to play around, with different things. They had, again, this is another intersection with Kim Library. At the time, he had reconstituted the end of LucasArts into probably the most advanced real-time graphics lab, that existed at the moment. Really insane stuff, right? Like stuff that even today would be really impressive to people. Like just they were playing around with this thing called Lucas Live, which was the sort of building blocks of the way that, virtual production stuff, right? And Mandalorian approaches and such. They allowed me at the same time, right, to be with one group that was a pure story department. So it was Rick Carter, the production designer, with Doug Chang and this, the best in class of their concept artists, conceiving of things that could happen in Star Wars that hadn't been written yet. There's like huge, like massive art moment, right? Just painting, stream of consciousness, Church of Rick Carter, ideation. And then writers would come in, Kiri Hart, the head of development, would bring writers in to be inspired by, and then they were writing scripts and looking at ideas at the same time. So it was pretty interesting that way. And then over on the other side, we're like, oh, well, let's see, what's the highest fidelity real time that we could possibly do? You know what I mean? In case we could one day, create essentially, episodic, live, or, otherwise real-time content. Other things that we got to play around with there. I mean, I started essentially this holographic cinema division. So we essentially took the idea of like big caves, that were at the time only used for like car design. And you would like, look at your car in stereo. And then we devised a method to actually free the, in a similar way, free the viewer to see that which was projected, from any angle, any perspective they want. But instead of cars, we put full Star Wars scenes with characters that were live driven by mocap actors, so that you could go in a full field of view holographic scene of Star Wars and have live interactions with characters. And to this day, it's still, it precedes, still there's no mixed reality glasses that can deliver, completely immersive full field of view holographic. And so this was a preview in a way, like it was a way to preview what it would be like. So there did all these sorts of things, did early VR, we had the first headsets from Oculus. We put Bob Iger inside of a headset for the first time to see, we created these, we called them immersive cinema tests. So we did these, okay, so this is fun. We essentially created this universal, and essentially this kind of universal media, a prototype. And essentially it was done with a kind of a modified game engine, and it was really, really beautifully rendered, scenes that took place inside of a Star Wars, a scenario. And so there's a whole dramatic scene that we, at first, the way we present this demonstration is, you would see what you thought was an experimental scene in a forthcoming movie. It looked that good, you could have believed that it was, a test scene from a forthcoming movie. But then somewhere along the way, we'd be like, oh, and we'll just like now drop the editing, and now you're there, right? So you're like now inside this dynamic real-time scene, and characters are still moving around, and there's like action going on in this live place. And you, at that point, had the ability to just wander where you wanted to. And what you realized you could do is you could go to all of the, so when movies a lot of times with movies, you have parallel actions, or like, hey, this is going on while this is going on, and you cut between those things. So, with this demonstration, you could see everything that was going on that you had cut away from before. And so you could be inside all of those different moments in totality. And then you could do other things in this demonstration. If you saw an X-Wing fighter, roar overhead during, some story moment, you could actually click on it, and you'd be in the driver's seat, and you would be taken down into a war scene, and then you could basically play and engage, in a battle, right? In a classic Star Wars battle. So you could kind of have this like omni-media, right, story.
Yeah, we still want that, John. We do want that.
It's relevant to what I care about now, right? Like, again, like you can potentially see a day where you can have those things live in the same space and serve people in the way that they want to, participate. Do they want to play? Do they want to be a supporting actor? Do they want to see someone else's story? But these things are now possible to converge, or we're heading that way.
John, it's so cool to hear about all that innovation and that really worked there on AR and VR. So you also spent some time at Magic Leap. I was curious what insights you might have gleaned there.
The strange thing is there's a lot of distortion, I think, out there in the blogosphere about Magic Leap, about I don't know if it's resentment or what have you, but like there was a lot of heat, as in a good heat. Like for a while, Magic Leap was a really interesting, very interesting, thing for a lot of people. A lot of there were some extremely talented people from all places converged around this this wild experiment to make mixed reality possible and spatial computing possible. There were, yes, billions of dollars raised and spent, and lots of it spent on raw experimentation, like lots of it, like lots and lots and lots of experimentation. There was some distortion on the outside about like, well, when will this day come? When we are given this ability to be inside of our, sort of mixed reality metaverse. And I think that is where a lot of confusion occurred with regard to, it's a very common thing to describe a destination, like a road we're walking on and toward, and do vision movies. All of the technology companies do these things, right? Whether it's Microsoft or Apple or Google or what have you, they create these destinations to inspire engineers and users too at some point, but like, hey, this is a place we want to go. This future is possible. Come here and help us build it. And for some reason, Magic Leap, when they tried the same thing, they basically got charged with like over promising this future too fast. But I don't think it was ever like described the arrival time, right? What was being described was the road that they wanted to be on. So I'll put that out there. Secondly, it wasn't their, inspiration alone. There was a period of time, some years I was there, where the most remarkable humans, on the planet, making companies, building cities, with grand visions for like the next paradigm of computing would come through the door every day of the week to explain their vision, their interest, right? Their interest in the potential of bringing computing into literally the spaces that we live and walk, right? That, that we could not just back to the beginning, not just stick computer graphics to the side of a wall, but have understanding of like what's going on here now, right? And to use that to essentially drive, a simulation that you could actually put over the top, and it could adapt according to what's happening. So, there was a lot of interest, not just there at Magic Leap, but coming from around the world. You could be a world-class educator and you want to try to show a simulation of how to, do a surgery. You could be an environmentalist and you want to see how the glacial, world is collapsing in live simulations run over the top. There's a lot of different use cases that people would come with, and it was, to the benefit of many to learn about those use cases, but the company, got itself caught up in some difficult burn rate issues and lost, probably one of the most promising group of people, I think. And those people dispersed into all of the labs, all the labs around the world, right, that are benefiting from some of that, near university-like education. Nobody else has been able to really pull it off quite yet either. I definitely anticipate and hope, I look forward to a time that, maybe Apple and others, do present, a nice next step. But it was actually kind of like two things at once. It was one of the most interesting experimental kind of times I've ever gone through, including meeting people I never thought I would have met. I mean, when I was in the movie business or, back, let's say in Lucasfilm before Magic Leap, I mean, to me, getting to meet Bob Iger was incredible, right? Here's an incredible person who's built the most phenomenal company you could imagine, right? Multimedia wonder company based on character, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, wow, that's intimidating to have a person like that come visit, although it was fine. He's great, super casual person, comfortable to be around. And I thought, wow, that's a big highlight in a career, getting a chance to meet and talk, right, ideas with a person like that. At Magic Leap, I mean, it's still Bob Iger would be that person, but at Magic Leap, incredible people would show up there every day of the week, mind-blowing, from every walk of life, not just entertainment. It was clear, it's full spectrum, has interest in this. So I don't know. I have no regrets. So, but you have this incredible time, and then you have the flip side as you watch probably the biggest unicorn of all time, crash to the ground.
I don't know if you were involved in the Mica demo, but
yes,
that was a big moment when Patrick, you could talk to a virtual character in AR, and it was really an experience. You get to go through it to feel what it's going to be to interact with digital human and not know what to expect, but the quality of the interaction that was super good back at the time. So,
Jarmanos, his special project, and he did quite an exquisite job with essentially micro expressions, really incredibly super subtle, capture, volumetric capture, but I couldn't even begin to explain it. I would highly recommend you talk to John Manos someday. He's an incredible person. But yeah, I mean, the dream at that time, again, Magic Leap imagined itself as the next version of Apple. It did. It had that kind of crazed ambition, but virtual humans, not just virtual humans, high fidelity virtual humans, highly expressive virtual humans, but also thinking virtual humans was a pet project over there. I mean, sitting here today, I didn't realize how far we were back then. That wasn't that long, but it was fairly far compared to where we are today. But that was the thought. All of these things you think are around the corner, the metaverse, right? All of these things you think are around the corner. And technically, it might be possible to erect a vertical, that can demonstrate, right, the possibility of things. But then you're really faced with the market having no idea that it wants that, right? You have to educate everybody. And there is a way to do that with some of these, with mixed reality. There is a way to potentially do that, but I'm not hung up on, mixed reality will come when it comes, but, real-time worlds and immersive worlds are here today. And they are really, I believe, the hub of many things. It's more like, what window would you like to put on this world? Is where we're at with all the rest.
So, John, we had the pleasure a few episodes ago. We had Ben Grossman came on the show, and he gave an interesting perspective around interaction. So he said for him, he just looks at his child and they don't care about the super high fidelity content. They're just happy with interactive content that runs on their iPad. Do you see it the same way?
Let's go back even further than kids with iPads. Let's go back to Walt Disney coming through your TV and telling you to use your imagination, right? And sort of provoking and prompting you to imagine beyond maybe something even you see, right? The child's imagination, a child can have blocks and they see worlds, with their inside of their blocks. So we have to kind of measure what actually a child is receiving that way, I think, right? If anything, it could be that some of this digital media is limiting their imagination because it's basically defining it for them. But let's just sort of take that off to the side. And there's no real, what your experience is about matters more than what it looks like. I'll say that, but the naturalness of realism is actually supports belief in a fantasy and a fiction, and so I think it's equally important. So it's two different subjects. I don't really. Do you need super high fidelity to have a compelling interactive experience? No, you don't, and not at all. You can use the most primitive things to have a really interesting experience, but does high fidelity produce a form of belief that could resonate in a different way, everlasting? Of course it does. It absolutely does. And I definitely think that whether it's immersive worlds, game worlds, that you see through a computer screen or some kind of VR goggles, or it's at some point the intertwining of simulation with the real world through mixed reality, I think all of those things are going to have huge impacts.
Yeah, that's a great thought. So wanted to switch gears a little bit, talk a little bit about InWorld and AI. So earlier this year, you joined InWorld AI as Chief Creative Officer. For our audience that may not know, could you tell us a bit about InWorld?
InWorld was founded by some folks that were core engineers and who produced work for Google DeepMind and for a thing called Google Dialogflow, which is a conversational sort of application that is, it's many applications now used in Google products. So they are essentially formerly elite Google AI and inventors and engineers. That they're young people, they like playing games and they like movies and stories, just like the rest of us. So they at some point decided that it would be more rewarding for them to aim at a more focused use case, and what they wanted to focus on was characters, basically. And they very smartly, it's a very simple premise that they are putting forward. What they believe is that games, are full of these non-playable characters that are support characters that help, provoke, prompt, or guide, or just stand around in your game to fill in the world and to help push you along in your experience. And they realize that there can be so much more to be done with that kind of element in game design. And so now their mission really is to basically build the minds of NPCs. And it will go, it will go a lot further than just, support, in a game mission down the line. But and that's the basic starter story.
So, John, what can we expect?
We've spent the last year speaking to some of the most remarkable creators, writers, IP makers, game designers, really people who understand how to world build, right, story build, and we've been trying to understand, call it the mechanical techniques that they use, the devices they use to create depth in a character, not a one-dimensional character, but a fully dimensional character that has understanding of self, history, and to some degree, the ability to evolve over time based on, change, context, right, inflection points. So we've been learning about what utilities, just to use a dry word, a writer might want, what devices a writer may want or a game designer may want, such that the character is not just, information, one-way information source. So, what you should be looking ahead at is far more sophisticated uses and abilities of these characters to essentially, progress across time with the player, right? And so as the player goes through their journey of their game or otherwise missions and adventures, the characters can essentially learn and sort of be updated as you go, as the world changes, let's say, even, right? So there are different ways to look at it. Let's say you have a game world and you want to populate that world full of characters, these NPCs that have, different, essentially roles. They fit archetypes. It's easy to like, hey, in Star Wars, you have droids and you have rebels and you have Siths, and, you can just divide up the character types into these archetypes. But of course, each one is an individual and they need a personality, a persona, a history, right? They have relationships to other characters. And so you can start to create a structure, if you will, where you're building on top of archetypes, as a base, and you can start, designing really interesting surface personas, right? And then start working on relationships of some to others. And so this is really fun. I mean, it's like the first time that you could really see people who are auteurs of level design and mechanics making, working with writer. It's a new intersection of talent that hasn't really existed quite yet up to this time. So there's a lot of experimentation. It is no small task. It's going to take, again, a while of experimenting, optimizing, tuning, seeing how players and fans really decide to engage, and then learn and then learn from that, right? So this is really the beginning of a road. There really are things you can do today. There's a near mid-far of this. There's things you can do right now. You can already have completely unexpected, kinds of conversations that make sense now, right? That are not, subject to hallucination and jumping the rails and all of that stuff. So we're in the beginning of structured. They're not intelligent. They're really, they're trained, if you will, right? It's like the art of mimicry, right? Trying to mimic, right, characters that we've seen before, but with new attributes.
That's fascinating. We could talk about this forever, but I think we're running out of time. So Patrick, you take us home.
Yeah, John, so we'd love to wrap up by asking if you could give a shout out to a person, people, or organization.
I will give a shout out to all of the people who spend, their many, many, many precious hours believing in, a better, newer thing. And they sacrifice quite a lot Not everyone gets rewarded as they deserve, but without that kind of community, really, things would just be really not fun. And so it's just a general shout out to all the innovators, the ambitious, the artists, all the people I've had the luck to meet.
Well, thank you, John Gaeta, Academy Award winner, serial innovator, entrepreneur. You've been in so many interesting adventures, always passionate about immersive storytelling. It was a pleasure talking to you today. I think we do hope the metaverse will open a new canvas for people like you to tell a new kind of stories. So we're very much looking forward to that.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to riff with you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Patrick. Big thank you to our audience. Please keep us your feedback. Feedback at buildingtheopenmetaverse.org is our email address. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you want to hear from. And we'll be back for another episode. Thank you very much.